By the end of 2017, Unturned had lost a bit of its momentum from the early access era. The game had shifted from a charming survival experience into a far more chaotic, PvP-oriented sandbox. Vanilla servers faced extinction, and performance issues which had been around practically since the beginning were still not fixed due to limitations within its code. Nelson decided it was time to move on, and there was an idea on his mind. After teasing a possible reiteration of Unturned for months, on November 11, 2017, he gave us a first look into Unturned 4.0, which would later be known as Unturned II, a sequel developed in an entirely new engine with unlimited potential. Needless to say, every new teaser on his blog helped put together the picture of an exciting new survival experience. Perhaps what could have been the rebirth of Unturned. Fast forward to today, however, it's been well over 2 years since the first devlog was released, but other than a very bare-bones version of a Horde mode remake, snippets of some gun and vehicle mechanics, and a few placeholder assets, there isn't much to look at. A large amount of players and content creators have moved on or disappeared completely, and on the surface most of what used to be the community of 3.0 seems to have finally washed away. With a grand total of around 35 devlogs as of now, a playable version of Unturned 2 is still on hold. So why exactly has progress been so slow, given how excited Nelson himself seemed to be when the game was originally announced? Given how great part of the community shifted away from actually playing the current version of Unturned to eagerly waiting for its sequel? It is quite telling of 4.0's development that even after abandoning this video for an entire year, not a lot has changed in regards to progress. Equally unfortunate as motivating for me to return to the topic. To help me better understand his point of view, Nelson Sexton himself was quite willing to answer a few of my concerns in a brief interview, and his clarifications will help enormously as we discuss further. For a start, burnout is not uncommon among developers overworking themselves on ambitious projects, and if a devlog from 2018 was anything to go off of, this likely didn't exclude Nelson. He told me that year he did experience the most severe burnout in a long time. This was around the same time he announced Pine Ridge, what should have been the first survival map introduced to the game, for which he had created hundreds of new props in a very short amount of time before scrapping the map altogether. Looking back on some of the insights he's provided in the past, the amount of scrapped and remade assets could be another indicator of prolonged development. As of late, however, Nelson has been avoiding burnout much more efficiently. Supposedly, he only experiences it a few times a year for short periods, and whenever he does, he resumes work on 3.0. Though this also means while exhilarated to move on to a new project in 2017, he now maintains a much more tempered excitement for 4.0. I will have to admit my stance for a while now has been that, given the scope of his new project, as well as his responsibility of supporting what is arguably one of the most popular free-to-play games on Steam on the side, Nelson simply cannot continue working alone. For undeniable as his accomplishments as a solo developer may be, so is the fact that the scope has changed. However, he tells me he doesn't plan on hiring anyone anytime soon, at least on the core development front. He says his games are still his passion projects to some degree, and make of that what you will. I came to wonder if he might be filling in over his head a little. Under constant pressure by the enormous expectations of his community, all the while still wishing things were as simple as back in 2014. I am not entirely sure this is the case, but if it were, it wouldn't surprise me. Progress has been as slow as it has. Finally, I wanted to know whether or not Nelson even sees the development of Unturned 4.0 as troubled in the first place, and it turns out he doesn't find it to be that way at all. Rather, he describes it as bumpy compared to 3.0's development. Much of what progress was being made on Unturned 2, in fact, seemed to depend greatly on how 3.0 was doing at the time, and I think this helped me come to a conclusion. Maybe a somewhat definitive reason for the so-called long wait for 4.0 is, as he puts it, I feel a commitment and responsibility to 3 because it has an active player base and customers, whereas 4 can be ready whenever it's ready. In essence, regardless of however the development part of Unturned 2 itself may have been handled, a comprehensive explanation as to why we've yet to see a playable version of the game might simply come down to the fact that while committed to some extent, he doesn't see an urgency in finishing the project. It's important to understand that looking past our perceptions of it, Unturned 4.0 was never more than a prototype. A fun proof of concept in regards to which Nelson doesn't owe us anything. And given Unturned's re-emerging player counts, as well as the overwhelming amount of optimizations and community support Nelson has provided in the last year alone, that seems like a very reasonable conclusion to come to. But, of course, that would be ignoring everything else.
Hello, we have something a little gruesome here today.
Time and time again I would hear a fellow Unturned player relay these words.
I'm waiting for 4.0.
Often in response to a question about a 3.0 related project, when all 4.0 would have to show for a long time was ideas. And yet, how could I blame them when in 2017 Unturned already had good old days to reminisce about, and when Nelson's development blogs often portrayed the project in a light that made it seem much further than it really was. Let's think about Pine Ridge again for a second. Announced as early 2018, it wouldn't have seemed far-fetched to think a stable release of 4.0 would be around the corner, only for the map to be scrapped and another 3 or so years of prototype development to continue. Then as recent as of January 2020, Nelson said he'd be aiming for a playable loop to be completed by the end of the year, which upon a series of astronomical calculations we may also notice didn't pan out. Context is also important, however. One of the reasons Nelson's development blogs even managed to reach such a great part of the community in the first place is the massive exposure from several large creators back in the day. So much of it, in fact, that it would be especially easy for a less attentive individual to make an erroneous assumption, also known as, though not intentionally, being deceived. Even those who read the fine print probably didn't expect it to be as far from completion as it turned out to be. The state of Unturned in 2018 was not exactly ideal in spite of player counts, with very few content updates and community figures suddenly moving on. So depending on the degree of exhaustion or disappointment in the franchise players were already feeling when 2 was announced, I do suspect the various announcements and teasers are what pushed many to jump ship and board the hype tanker. And that does include me. There was a time when most Unturned content you'd see on YouTube was related to 4.0, when the game didn't even have a definitive title yet. Despite there having been other factors at play in my long hiatuses, I recall I'd often tell myself, there is no more time to make videos on 3.0, whenever I would think of putting something together. Besides, fellow creators whom I loved to compete with left the scene barren, which I felt either prompted me to move on to something else or stop. That was 3 years ago. And there is still an interest in Unturned content if the quality is high enough, while the free time I had back then is definitely gone. I feel sad sometimes thinking of the ideas that never came to be due to this mindset, but I don't lose sleep over it. The long wait in the title isn't the actual time spent in anticipation for 4.0 to be released, as much as it represents the state of a community put on hold out of a promise that was never made. I asked Nelson if he wishes he'd kept the project in the dark for longer, and he seems to agree, but he gives a very sensible reason as to why he didn't. Simply put, secretly prototyping did not feel like the right thing to do, given the resulting lack of updates at a time 3.0 was struggling somewhat. So much like I can't blame content creators for doing their thing, I cannot blame Nelson for trying to restore people's hope in his franchise. Around April this year, Nelson announced he would resume work on Unturned 2 again after a couple months of refocusing his efforts on 3.0 entirely. He'd learned from the time he spent on 4.0 and used the experience to improve the game in areas he'd seen as unfixable for a long time. Wow. But his return to 3.0 has also helped him notice somewhat of an identity crisis in what Unturned 2 should actually be. Namely, something entirely new, as opposed to a collection of neat improvements from the current version, which without a fleshed out core, don't make for compelling gameplay. Either way, the last devlog was posted 6 months ago, so before this concept truly comes to fruition, it's likely Nelson will be far more conservative in how much he chooses to share. So just when will Unturned 2 finally release? I don't know, and Nelson doesn't either, but probably a very long while from now would be an educated answer. On the one hand, I miss the time before the silence was broken, when people saw the franchise for what it was at the time, and when players felt more inspired to create content for the game. But I'm just an old man, so of course I'd want that. You know, the more I reflect on what has come of 4.0 and the things Nelson has chosen to share, the more I come to think that he was never sure of what he wanted the game to be in the first place, other than some sequel. A sequel Unturned desperately needed in 2017, but which, thanks to his recent efforts, as well as the talents holding his community together, it no longer needs as badly. And yet, here's a quote from an old blog post, long before 4.0 was even announced and largely out of context, but which Nelson looks back on now. He says,
I had recently been considering how to handle Unturned 4 with all the big upgrades I want to do, but following the conference I am positive that the right thing to do is gradually refactor Unturned into the best game it can be, no matter how difficult, i.e. 4.0 will be a future update, not some sequel or huge delay between updates or reboot that would harm the community.
I'll pick this up and check this out.